taking action for you this morning on TV 20 Detroit starts right now.
What's happening in entertainment with Greg Dunmore of PulseBeat.tv.
Welcome to another edition of PulseBeat with Greg Dunmore. And if you hear excitement in my voice, it's because we just found out that we have been nominated for the Emmy Award. And it's because of you that we do what we do. So that nomination is our nomination. And we're also excited because we're going to sit down and talk to Lee Hawkins. He's got a new podcast entitled What Happened in Alabama. And although times are not what they used to be, the struggle still continues. And he's got insight. He's got the knowledge that when you listen to his podcast, believe me, you're going to want to listen to every episode. So stay tuned as we talk to Lee Hawkins, and we're going to find out what happened in Alabama. It is such a compelling, such a moving podcast. You've got to turn it on. And so I'm thinking there's so many other people potentially that should be attracted to what you're doing. And so what buttons are you pushing?
Okay, if you were ever told by a family member or a friend that you forgot where you came from, you know, you're doing a little too well out there, or, you know, anything that felt like it may have come from slavery, or it may have come from a mindset of people trying to hold you back, or trying to hate on you for different things that just don't make sense, for pursuing excellence and for being the best version of yourself, this is a podcast for you. I don't think that this is a podcast for people who want to maintain the status quo. If you were that person in your family who was a cycle breaker, or who is a cycle breaker, who wants to break the chains of a lot of the different patterns that you saw in your family that were toxic, that were not really, that just upset and disrupted your spirit, this is a podcast for you.
My name is Lee Hawkins. I've been a journalist for 25 years. I research, listen, and ask a lot of questions. My story begins in 1980s Minnesota, in the Twin Cities suburb of Maplewood. We were a Black family living in a predominantly white neighborhood.
Oh, Maplewood, it was really interesting.
It certainly was. My childhood was marked by so many things. Watching our backs on the walk home from school, getting our hair cut in the Black neighborhood, and church on Sundays.
All right. Who's on the Lord's side?
That's my dad, Leroy Hawkins Sr., singing in our church. He taught me how to sing. We played music together, and he really believed in me.
When you grew up, everything you touched was great.
From the time I was a little kid, it was always me and him, Lee Sr. and Lee Jr., Leroy and Lily. But while my dad was happy at church, nightmares interrupted his sleep sometimes. He'd wake up screaming, startling the whole house. It scared me so much as a kid. One morning, I got the courage to ask him what he was dreaming about. He just looked down at the floor and said, "Alabama, son, Alabama."
People who want to actually take the good from the previous generations, but reject the parts of the things that our parents and our grandparents imposed on us, or tried to impose on us, because they just didn't know any better.
Is it cross-generational for, do you think younger people as well as not so young people, are they going to all be able to connect with the podcast?
I think so. I think that this is especially for younger people, because let me just give you a quick example. A few weeks ago, we had the Morehouse College graduation. And if you remember, President Biden was set to speak there, and almost right away, the young Black men at Morehouse College were saying, well, we don't know if we want you to come. And they were saying, we don't know if we want you to come because of what's happening in Israel with the Palestinian people, and their perceived, their perceptions of, I'm not going to get into that issue, but their perceptions of what the injustice against the Palestinian people were. And I looked at that and I thought, well, you know what? This is Dr. Martin Luther King's college, and Dr. Martin Luther King was a global thinking man. Yes, he was. But it also showed me that these young black men maybe needed to have a little bit more of grounding in history and understanding America's treatment of black American descendants of slavery and Jim Crow, because that was an opportunity for them to say, no, President Biden, we don't want you to come unless you talk about what you're going to do on the issue of reparations for slavery, the issues for reparations for Jim Crow, because Jim Crow was an apartheid system of 100 years, and there are millions of black people alive today who went through the system of Jim Crow who have never been paid restitution for what they went through. There's not clean water in Flint, Michigan right now, okay? They could have said that. What is your agenda for black Americans? And I think because this podcast really peels back the layers and explains through the family of my story what the injustices were against black people through the generations and how that impacted our families. And I think if the young people of today's generation are not well rooted in the trauma that our people went through and lived through and survived through and thrived through, then that's when it starts to become about all these other groups, which, by the way, I never want to discount the need for there to be justice for any child, Jewish or Palestinian, that's suffering in Israel right now, or justice for the LGBTQ community, justice for undocumented immigrants, justice for all of these other people. And black people are always leading the charge for all of these other groups. And all of these other groups have hitched their wagon to Black Lives Matter and to our movement. But in terms of our people, when our people don't know our history, then a lot of times it does become about everybody else except us, and then we end up carrying the burden, as we have throughout the history, carrying the whole nation on our back, instead of saying it takes a nation of millions to hold us back, right? And so that's what we have to look at. This podcast really educates people so that they can start to understand what the issues are and what the agenda of the black American descendants of slavery really is. And I'm not talking about people who came here from the Caribbean. I'm not talking about people who came here from West Africa. I'm not talking about people who came here in 2000. I'm talking about the African American people who were here before 1900, who led women's suffrage, who led the civil rights movement, and who did all of these things to get basic rights, so all of these other people could come in and benefit. I don't want this group of people to be forgotten, and I want this group of people to be studied. And so the reason I did this podcast was to help the black American descendants of slavery and Jim Crow learn more about their history, start to unpack a lot of the mental health and emotional impact and spiritual impact of white supremacy on our families and our communities, because just because we lived through it and we've thrived through it doesn't mean that we weren't affected by it. And I think the last thing, and this is a really important point, is that if you look at a lot of the different celebrities, everybody from Snoop Dogg to Nick Cannon and many other people, they've said, well, I'm tired of hearing about slavery. I'm tired of seeing slave movies, right? And I understand from the perspective, of
Little
saying,
Wayne said that racism doesn't exist.
Right, racism doesn't exist. But I understand it from the perspective of saying, you know, I would like to see a diversity of different stories from the African American experience. But to say, I'm tired of slave movies, or I don't want to hear about trauma, well, guess what? I think when you say that, you can't then say that you don't agree with DeSantis, or you don't with Governor DeSantis, or you don't agree with Senator Mitch McConnell. I think that we have to start to be honest that there are a lot of black people who are actually right in line with the GOP and what the GOP is saying. because the GOP is saying, we don't want to hear about black trauma either. We want to take it out of the curriculum. We don't want future generations
Banning
to know
books now, yeah.
the truth of history. We don't want future generations reading James Baldwin. And so be careful what you wish for, because that's exactly the agenda that is being pushed. And it's one of the reasons that the black men at the most prestigious, storied, iconic institution, collegiate institution in the country, Morehouse College, had the president of the United States come to their college and turn their back on the president on the basis of Palestine and not on the basis of black America and what black America's agenda is.
Asking questions can lead to answers that lead to healing. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
There is so much strength and power in this history. If you look at history as a foundation, the foundations that were laid are still what have built our houses.
This is What Happened in Alabama, a new podcast from APM Studios. I get answers to some of the hardest questions of how things came to be for many black Americans and the truth that must come before any reconciliation can happen.
Feel the good vibe and, the Greg Dunmore vibe. This is more than a show. That's why the name of it is the Greg Dunmore vibe, and it's really about a great vibe. And I have joining me, calling from New York, Mr. Lee Hawkins, who's also an award-winning NABJ award-winning journalist. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist for what he did reporting for or on the Tulsa Massacre. He has had a career that has just been international because of the Wall Street Journal. He is the CEO of Lee Hawkins Productions, and he is soon to be, I'm going to say, an award-winning author. Just let the audience know, just in a sentence, just let them know why the National Association of Black Journalists and the awards that you have for from that just remarkable group of journalists. Why is this an award that would have no equal?
Just because it's an award from your peers, a black journalist, and every year we get together in fellowship. And for me, it's really a meditational and really reflective time because it brings the best and brightest journalists from all over America to one city, and it brings the black people together, and it just gives us an opportunity to compare notes. I know that earlier in my career, I established relationships with a lot of mentors, and what they really do for you is they help you work through a lot of the things that really can't be taught, like the corporate politics and how to follow through stories to the end, and all of those things that you might not otherwise get if you're, one of the few black people in a newsroom. Yes. So a lot of times it's good just to have that support network.
So to be honored by your own is something that is priceless. It gives you a spiritual vibe like none other. Now, I told you that I was friends with attorney Kimberly Crenshaw. She and I, we went to Cornell at the same time, and she is one of the people that came up with the critical race theory. And when I talked to you, you told me that you also have something that I think will become part of a bigger picture of discussion. And you told me it's a phrase and it's an ideology that needs to be discussed, and you entitled it "The War on Black Excellence." Can you tell this audience the war on black excellence would mean what?
Well, okay, so I am a journalist, but I also call myself a mental abolitionist and a soldier for black excellence, and what I call the war against black excellence. And what that is it's a centuries-long war that is it started during slavery in America, and there were rules that were established that black people had to follow. We couldn't read or write by law. There were lashes involved if black people were caught reading or writing. There was incarceration. There was punishment. We couldn't wear clothes up to a certain value. Like, there were all kinds of restrictions on us, and I believe that a lot of us have internalized those racist stereotypes in modern times to believe, for instance, that a black person speaking a certain way qualifies them as acting white as opposed to just speaking professional language, or a black person being educated is a problem. I've seen it happen to Russell Wilson, the football player, where people have called him corny because, he's always talking about his wife and his children. And, that goes all the way back to slavery, with the idea that our families were pulled apart and they didn't want our black men to be loving their families and to be even with their families. So they were sold away. And so I think that these modern manifestations of centuries-long racial tropes and stereotypes has started what we need to wage a war against. That I'm neither a Democrat or a Republican. I'm a journalist, but I'm passionate, if not self-righteous, about the idea of black Americans being mentally free to define themselves and be their authentic selves based on their dreams, their aspirations, and their whole being. And we are in a war for the minds of our children and the hearts of our children. And they have to know that being black does not mean that you have to be in poverty to be black, that you have to be uneducated to be black. If you happen to be in poverty and you happen to be black, those are two separate things. They're not part of the black identity.
And sometimes we can be our own worst enemies, Lee, and sometimes we can be our own worst enemies. I call it a dysfunctional, D-I-S-R-E-S-P-E-C-T, a dysfunctional disrespect. Now, there was a point that you made that ties into something that just happened. Hill Harper, the actor who was a Harvard-trained attorney, he was brilliant in his oratory as he addressed a group of community people at Wayne County Community College District, which is in the heart and soul of downtown Detroit, in a series called Global Conversations. And it was in salute of Harry Belafonte, and he was being interviewed by someone on this station, Bankerley Thompson. And I wrote something about his speech and the conversation, and I thought he was brilliant. And then I get this message that was, to me, it was an attack not only on Hill Harper, but it was an attack on me as well because of what I wrote in glowing terms about what Hill Harper I felt was so worthy of being respected. And I get this message, not even qualified. Here's the thing. We need to stop letting the bourgeoisie tell us who calls these folks and tells them Detroit, Michigan is ripe for the steal. Gatekeepers and boot liquors. And he goes on concerning why Hill Harper is obviously someone that he's not endorsing. And this was from an African-American. What say you, Lee? Hawkins.
Well, okay, so whoever wrote you that letter, first of all, they're trying to be the gatekeeper. Okay, so they're the one saying that he's not qualified and he shouldn't be able to run. The key is this. If I were someone who were a politician in Detroit and I had aspirations to be in the United States Senate and Hill Harper moved in town, I would be scared too. And I think that, this is a guy who has 2 Harvard graduate degrees. He's been at the highest echelons of Hollywood. He's done a lot of work on criminal justice reform. He's been in the community. He's been an activist. And what they're doing is just using that same strategy that was actually used effectively, if you can believe this, against Barack Obama when he ran against Bobby Rush, Congressman Bobby Rush in Chicago. Yes. They said he was an educated fool. They said he's not like us. He's from the Ivy League halls. And that was enough to get black people to vote against Barack Obama, who later would become the leader of the New World. But that's how deeply ingrained this self-hatred is.
Pulse of a new generation. PulseBeat.TV.
If you like what we're doing, please tell a friend. Or if you want to see what we've done again, go to PulseBeatGlobal.com. That's PULSEBEATGLOBAL.com. PulseBeat.com. You can also go to our PulseBeat TV YouTube channel and you can revisit what we're doing. And once again, you can tell everybody that we're doing something that is so exciting that they wouldn't want to miss it. Remember PulseBeatGlobal.com or the YouTube channel PulseBeat TV. Thanks for telling the world about us.
Pulse of a new generation. PulseBeat TV.
You're listening to the Greg Dunmore vibe, and like I said, this is more than just a show. It's about a vibe, and adding to this vibe, making it exceptional, is the NABJ Award, multi-award winning Mr. Lee Hawkins calling from New York. And we've got a caller as well, so right before we bring in the caller, Lee, I cut you mid-sentence, so complete that thought, and then we're going to take a call.
Okay, great. So while I'm not here to endorse Hill Harper, but I am here to support his right, or any other black person's right, to participate in the political process by running for public office in Detroit, no matter what. If they qualify, they should be able to run. And it's scary to me that anyone, especially a black person, would suggest that he should not run or that he would not be electable because he's what they define as black elite, or because he's educated, or because he's famous, or because he's wealthy, and therefore he has not experienced enough struggle to be qualified to run and to represent a majority black district. That's crazy to me. In fact, it's eerily similar, Greg, to what a white supremacist would say.
Wow.
And that he's not a real black man because he didn't grow up in a housing project. His parents didn't struggle to put food on the table. That's romanticizing poverty, and poverty has nothing to do with black identity. You can be a person living in poverty who happens to be black, but poverty is not fundamental to the black experience.
I totally agree. We've got caller Rick on the line. Rick, how are you doing? And welcome to the Greg Dunmore vibe with very special guest, Mr. Lee Hawkins. How are you doing, and what's your question?
I think Hill Harper is a great candidate, first off. Let me clear that up. But that's neither here nor there. The issue is that we don't have like a set criteria for a candidate. In other words, the candidate doesn't really have to say, I hear about housing issues from Mary Johnson, who's been collecting complaints about housing issues, or I hear about workers' issues from Jimmy at, this union or this group, laying that stuff out, how you hear about people's problems. That's key, because what everybody is wanting from advocates and politicians is an organized response. One of the issues that has come up, and it should be addressed because it's a legitimate issue, and that is, what was Mr. Harper's relationship to, this one person I've heard who had a complaint about Mr. Harper's handling of their issue and the Flint water issue. So we just break that down and we find out what it is, because a lot of times these things are misunderstandings and, different interpretations.
Well, I appreciate the point that you're making, and Rick, I don't mean to cut you off, but we are kind of turning the wheel.
Sorry.
No. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, and I don't know about the Flint
I know
crisis.
You got an entertainment show too, man.
Yeah, I know, but then again, Hill Harper is an actor, and so we talked about him as well.
Yeah.
But
I caught on to that. Let me let that go. Thank you. May3.com.
Okay, thanks so much for calling in. You know what? He's still listening, so if you want to say something to him, Lee, say something to him. He's still listening.
I think that he raises some really good points. A lot of this really is about process, and I think when you break it down to the issues and not to the person and the background of the person, as if there is some kind of monolithic experience that we have as black people or as people in urban communities. If you just stick to the issues like you did, Rick, that's great. I think that there are many people who have been part of the political machine in the process, Rick, as you pointed out, in Detroit, who are threatened by an outsider coming in.
Yes, and so
I think we need as many people sitting down at the table with diverse perspectives and lived experiences to actually help out. You may not know the lady on the corner, and I think that right now it seems like that's what he's trying to do.
Yes, exactly. And so I think that people sometimes hold people to a standard that might be unfair, and just because you live somewhere does not mean that you are thinking where you need to think. And I always said it's not always how you look, it's how you think.
My goal was to be a professional football player. That's what I wanted to do, right? And I got to Brown University. I ended up meeting so many people that were interested in art and politics, and I was wide open. And suddenly, this guy that just loved sports became fanatical about all these other things. A wonderful professor who has passed away now, he pulled me to the side one day and he said, listen, I think you're the most brilliant student I've ever had in my class, but you're underperforming. You're taking whatever place or whatever expectations people have of you as a black male for granted. Do you want to live a life where you just skate by? Or do you want to live a life of impact and legacy? I made a drastic shift. I decided that excellence in whatever I did was going to be my calling card.
The podcast, What Happened in Alabama, is going to be award winning. So how can people immediately get to the podcast? What's the easiest way and the fastest way to tune in to your podcast?
Well, it's everywhere. It's on Spotify, it's on Apple, everywhere. And you can also find it at whathappenedinalabama.org. Whathappenedinalabama.org. And just so you don't forget, I suggest that you pre-order the book, I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, on Amazon.com.
It is our honor to talk to you, Lee Hawkins, the award-winning Lee Hawkins.
Thank you. And Pulse Beat is one of my favorite shows. I was really honored to be on the show when we talked about Hill Harper, because you're breaking through a lot of the different boundaries of the media business. You know, I think that a lot of the conversations that we have are recycled and old, and you break new ground. So, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a guest, but even just the idea that I'm sitting here talking about some of these concepts that would, you know, be considering challenging the status quo is a good thing, because it makes people nervous sometimes when you start to talk about black excellence. And so your show challenging, giving me a platform to talk about that is good, because we first have to accept that equality is something we're still getting used to as a nation. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it, because I don't think I would say this on traditional media, but I don't think it would stay in. I think it would be edited out. And this is why you are the bomb for allowing us to talk the truth on your show.
I can't say the best is yet to come, because you're already the best. And guess what? In your case, the best is not about to come. The best will continue, because Lee Hawkins, you're already the best.
Thank you, brother. God bless you, and God bless Detroit. I love you, Detroit.